It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George back at Iowa State University. School's out, but the doc is still here. Dr. Stefan Schmidt is still on the case, and he's working the political scene here, and he's been doing some interviews around the country, and he's agreed to come on podcast by George. And I hope you've been checking out the podcast with the good doctor in-house, because he is a Lucan professor here at Iowa State University. He's written the textbook that is the authority on political science in classrooms around the country, and he's heard worldwide analyzing politics. And today is kind of homegrown. We're going to be talking about issues of the heartland, particularly these tariffs and how they're affecting American agriculture and the production of soybeans and corn here in the heartland. But a little bit of housekeeping here. Before the situation in Iran, that's top of mind right now. And some people have been asking, what's going to happen? Do you think that that's just saber rattling by the Trump administration, or is there something that we need to really be concerned about right now with Iran?
It's really difficult to say, because there have been those 4 attacks on oil tankers belonging to countries that are adversaries of Iran, Saudi Arabia and Qatar and some of those countries. Somebody snuck up on them, probably with scuba gear, and blew holes in them. They didn't sink, but they were damaged. And though a lot of the countries in the region, of course, are very nervous about Iran, not so much because of their nuclear weapons, but because they support a lot of these surrogates that are fighting in places, Palestine, in places like Syria. And so there is a realistic tension in that region. And I think the Trump administration says that they had indications that either the Iranians or their proxies were going to do damage to American troops that are still operating in places like Iraq or Iraq and Syria. And you want to believe the U.S. military and U.S. intelligence or not, that's up to you. But it does look like it's kind of a move to deter Iran from expanding its meddling in the Middle East, not so much with nukes, but with conventional warfare and supporting other groups. So that, to me, it looks like the U.S. is essentially telling Iraq to tone that down and to protect countries like Saudi Arabia and other U.S. allies in the region. And some of those allies, of course, are trouble for us anyway. Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia. They're allies, but they also pose some issues for us.
Well, yeah.
Israel in particular, with the Palestinians, Egypt with a regime that is not a democratic regime, and Saudi Arabia, of course, we know all the stories about.
I can't make heads or tails
them,
of Saudi Arabia, honest to God. And Israel, I've always been worried about, regardless of how you feel about our relationship with them, because of their history. Yeah. They have a tendency to act first and ask questions later.
Yes.
I mean, they won't fool around. And
right. And so those are some of the American allies in the region that I think we're trying to protect from increased Iranian activity. And others, of course, who are more cynical than I am, and that's pretty hard to find, but are saying that President Trump is doing the wag the dog, if you remember the movie and the book, where a war is artificially created to distract attention.
Domestic issues,
right.
Yeah.
And so that, if you tend in that direction, and a lot of people do, you're going to say, well, it's just Trump making this up because his son is going to be testifying in front of, Congress, the Senate in this case, which the Republicans have called his son to testify. And there are a bunch of other things that President Trump might want to detract from. I hope that's not the case, because that would mean that the U.S. intelligence services and the U.S. military is basically complying with something that is not real and putting at risk perhaps American troops. I mean, there was a story that the U.S. is planning to, put a huge number of American troops, almost as many as we had in Iraq, back into the region. And today we saw that the Americans are basically evacuating civilians from the American embassy in Iraq, which is usually not a great sign. Right? Not a great sign. So we're all, basically biting our lips and waiting to see how this evolves, because Iran is a tough country run by some really tough political forces. They don't like to be publicly humiliated and threatened, even though they often have not behaved very well. And so, this is on top of everything else that's going on, including the trade war with China and the, as you mentioned, declining financial situation for the agricultural sector in the U.S. It just is too much for us to digest, I think.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I give that some veracity, one of the reasons I'm concerned about it, our president's a bit of a blowhard, to say the least, so he likes to go back and forth with leaders around the world, but there's a poison pill running around in Washington that has me very worried, and that's that John Bolton guy, Mr. White Mustache. If people are not, they don't know who I'm talking about here. I've always heard that he wakes up in the morning wanting to go to a war with Iran. I mean, that's top of his agenda.
Bolton is one of the most hawkish people that has been in various administrations in Washington, including ambassador to the UN with Bush. And I think the Trump administration now has moved far into the more hawkish foreign policy environment. Most of the more cautious, diplomacy-oriented members of his administration, including the former Secretary of Defense, but Secretary of State and others have left. And so there is that. And of course, a lot of people are saying, well, when there are a lot of bad guys running around with guns, shooting people and killing and raping, maybe you need the cops to get a little tougher. And certainly you can say that in the Middle East, once the Bush administration made the horrible mistake of overthrowing Saddam Hussein, it basically opened the floodgate for Iran to dominate one part of that region. The other countries that I've mentioned, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, strangely enough, Israel is now in that group. Those countries are the other, if it's a scale, on the other side of the scale to balance off a little bit. But Iran is a big player, a really big player. And so it may be that it is necessary to rattle some swords at least, and hopefully not use them. But there's a real big American military presence. I've always been a big advocate of, don't go in with the minimal force that you think is necessary.
Military guys tell you the same thing.
Go in with overwhelming force.
Yep.
And say, this is what we have, and you guys, don't mess with us. Because Jimmy Carter discovered with trying to rescue the American hostages from Iran, if people are old enough to remember that.
I was in the newsroom,
Yeah, the Iranian regime took over the U.S. Embassy and took all of our diplomats hostage. And Jimmy Carter approved a rescue mission, but decided to use the minimal number of airplanes, helicopters, and troops necessary to execute it. And when they landed in the desert preparing to launch and there was an accident, they didn't have enough assets left to complete the mission. And that should be a lesson to anyone, go in and get her done.
Get her done. Well, one of the reasons I mentioned John Bolton, now this guy's the head of the NSA, again, for some of our listeners that aren't that familiar with him. He couldn't, as the doc mentioned, he couldn't be any further in the swamp. Trump talked about draining the swamp or whatever. This guy goes way back. He's been around forever. And I was thinking of you this past week because I saw some reports We were talking about the Mueller report in the last podcast, and how nations meddle in each other's affairs, and how not everybody, but a lot of people think that the United States is under attack by Russia, and our electoral process has been compromised because of activity on Facebook and Twitter. John Bolton is using his personal Twitter account to communicate on Twitter to the rebels, the opposition in Venezuela. This is the head of the NSA in the United States. You talk about meddling. There couldn't be any more upfront meddling in the use of Twitter. And I thought, that's just kind of what the good doctor was talking about in the last podcast.
Yeah, isn't it unbelievable that Twitter has become such a tool for conducting affairs?
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost unbelievable that President Trump basically is guiding the United States, if you can call it that, with Twitter. That's where we get all the information. That's where he announces his policies. And in the earlier comment when I said, problems in the Middle East, problems with trade with China, of course, there were others in Venezuela, is one I should have mentioned, because Venezuela has become a real inflammation, let's call it that, with the Russians now supporting the regime there, having Russian troops there. The Cubans have 30, 40,000 Cubans in Venezuela. They go there as doctors and as consultants and also as teachers, but they're all part of the Cuban intelligence operation and Cuban military services. And so suddenly now on this hemisphere, we have Nicaragua, which is still run by Daniel Ortega, and the communists that Ronald Reagan and others tried to end with the Contras years ago. You have Venezuela and you have Cuba, and you have a very leftist government now in Mexico, right on the U.S. border. So the international scenarios of where the U.S. has to conduct policy has increased a great deal. At one point we were really concentrating on Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan subsequent to the World Trade Center attacks. I mean, that's why we shifted so much power and so much energy there, and the invasion by Saddam Hussein of Kuwait. Now we're all over the place. We have to have a Pacific fleet that checks China, which has huge military ambitions in the Pacific. We have a carrier group now approaching the Persian Gulf and positioning itself there. Presumably, we're going to have to put a military contingent somewhere in the Caribbean in case President Maduro in Venezuela decides to go bananas and do something that is a threat to maybe the neighboring countries. Wow, talk about overcommitting internationally. It's really going to be very interesting for the next few years. And the Democrats have a challenge because the Democrats haven't talked about foreign policy hardly at all.
Yeah, they're
the 23 or is it 26 today? I'm not sure.
I honestly
every hour another Democrat declares. They don't have much of a foreign policy pronouncement, position on either trade with China or the situation in the Middle East. They criticize Trump, but other than that, they don't have clear alternatives. And until the Democrats do that, the initiative is going to be with the Trump administration, clearly. Because even farmers in Iowa, who are, really suffering a lot right now, are not going to abandon deregulation and things like that the Trump administration and that Republicans have given them until they know who's in charge of the Democratic machine and the Democratic Party. And you and I don't know who's in charge. There are too many candidates, and Joe Biden, former Vice President Biden, is at the top of the polls. Everyone that I talk to is certain that he is going to crash and burn again. He's had some really bad let's call it presentations. He was on The View, the television, the cable series
Yeah.
The View, and I watched that, and I was shocked at how distracted and unfocused he
appears.
was.
Yeah, he was. I saw it, and I said that on the podcast at his kickoff in Des Moines.
Very
Yeah.
poor. And I just got on Monday of this week a 3-paragraph summary of Biden's rollout in New Hampshire, and I wish I could read it. I don't have it with me. It was extremely negative. They said that he seemed disoriented, unfocused, not compelling, didn't seem to be really in charge, and that it was hugely disappointing in spite of this poll number. So when the first debates begin, there's a lot of worry that the front runner of the Democrats in the polls is going to underperform. So when we look at all these crises and all these issues that we've already talked about, the question always comes back to how are the Democrats going to handle these crises, or at least these tensions, in a way that's different from the Trump administration, and is it going to be better in the sense of the outcomes? And we don't know that.
Yeah.
So the Democrats have to, I think, move a lot quicker than they are in sculpting out their agenda and who's going to be in charge.
How much do you put in the accuracy of the polling, particularly at this early stage, but particularly because of how wrong they were in 2016? I remember when they first did the earliest polls on these Democratic candidates, and, Joe Biden and, of course, Bernie leapt to the front. And people, well, that's name recognition. That's how early it is. They don't know these other people. Then comes this Pete Buttigieg guy, and I hadn't even heard of him. I mean, the guy's a mayor of a town in Indiana.
Right,
he goes right to the top of the polls. What's this all about, this polling?
It is early. I agree with you. And you have to remember, and I know that your listeners know this, so, I'm not wanting to insult them. A poll is a very perishable thing. If I ask 100 people today a question about, well, what do you think of the weather? Well, let me put it this way. If I ask them tomorrow, and today they said, it's really great, I love it, tomorrow the weather in Iowa is going to suck, and they're going to say, I hate it. And so the polls are like that. They only measure what people are seeing, in this case in candidates, today. And tomorrow they may feel or see something else because they've heard something new, because the environment has changed, and maybe there will be peace in the world, and some other candidate in the Democratic Party will seem a lot more realistic than Joe Biden with his foreign policy experience. So we don't know. But in any case, candidates take advantage of where they are in the polls. And the Democratic Party is set up, and I will say this, and apologies to my Democratic friends who I'm sure listen to this, they have just made such incredible, stupid decisions. How they're going to conduct the debates in terms of who can debate, you have to get 1% in the polls at least, I think, 2 months in a row. You have to have so many people donating in so many different states. Guys, Democrats, gals, cut it out. Make it simple so that people can understand what you're doing. And the same with the Iowa caucuses. Let me tell you, the Iowa caucuses were, quote, reformed because the last time there was so much confusion. Yeah. And I'm starting to look at the reforms. They're not reforms.
They can't even
made it
them.
more complicated, and I can't use
confusing.
Some of the language here, but I'll tell you, the absentee ballots are going to be counted in a completely different way from the ones that are on site. And on site, they haven't improved at all how they're going to run those. Why don't you just simplify it so people can understand it? And the answer is that the Democrats are so paranoid about diversity and representation in the caucuses that they want to sort of lean over backwards and not make it too simple, because if it's too simple, then the clear majority of Democrats will always win because minorities, are minorities. And so the quota systems and all that are wonderful intellectually and in terms of fairness and so on, but it confuses voters a lot.
Yeah.
And the media, too.
Let's talk a little bit then about this tariff circumstance that's afflicting the farmers right now. And for the listeners on the podcast, to kind of set the groundwork a little bit for me personally, I grew up on a farm, Democratic family. I mean, we weren't marching in the streets or anything, but they voted Democratic. My dad always told me, he said, son, Republicans can't stand prosperity. He said they liked Eisenhower. We about starved to death under Eisenhower. The Reagan era came along, and after that Soviet grain embargo and the OPEC crisis under Jimmy Carter, Reagan came along, and small farmers went bust. Some of them, a lot of them, never came back. The void was kind of filled by these large corporation farmers that are still out there making a go of it now, and because they have the economy of scale, by and large, that's got a lot to do with it. And now we've got another Republican president in there, and these tariffs are really hurting farmers and have the potential to get worse here. They're talking about the tariffs going up and the prices going down, and I'm seeing semis of grain going to the elevator this time of year, which is a little unusual. Farmers are selling. It also has to do with the bad weather and the flooding and the climate change stuff that we have. The crops are getting in late. There's reduced acreage, and there is some bounce in the price, and so they're wanting to sell while they can because they are anticipating it possibly getting worse. What do you make of all that, Doc?
Agriculture and farming has always been a high-risk occupation, and one that people are so emotionally tied to. If you own a farm and it was passed on from your grandfather or great-grandfather to you, you really hang on to it, in spite of all the hardship and losses that you may be incurring. And that explains a lot of the way farmers behave.
Couldn't be more right.
All right, so that's one part.
Yeah, that's a great start.
Those are the family farmers.
Yeah.
Corporate farms are different. Mm-hmm. Corporate farms are, as you said, enterprises of scale. In some ways, they are more like industries than traditional family farms. And if they're really smart and astute, they will diversify to the point where the commodity prices for row crops are less important, because if the price of corn is $3 or less, which is
close,
terrible, and it's almost there,
yep,
it doesn't matter, because they also have an ethanol plant that they're invested in and that perhaps they even started down the road.
Yeah.
They have a feedlot where that corn can go and be turned into beef or into hogs, or have deals with turkey and egg production facilities. And so they can move their low commodity price row crops around and add value domestically without worrying too much. And in fact, $3 corn, $2.50 corn is great if you are feeding animals. You don't want it to be, $5 or $8, which it never goes, right? Because it's your feed. And so people don't understand that part of it. Family farms really can't do that in a way.
No, they don't have the scale. They don't have the diversification.
They don't have the diversification. And you might have some cattle or be feeding, some hogs. But the scale is so small, even if you feed them your grain, you're not making anything.
And if you can't afford crop insurance, that's very important.
Yeah, it is.
You're compromised. You're dead coming out of the chute almost if you can't afford.
And of course, if you don't own the land, then you're finished, because then you have to rent the land. And so I feel terrible for young people who want to take over, who want to get into agriculture. If your family owns a farm, that's a different story, even if it's a small farm, 500 acres, which you no longer can make a living on. So a lot of agriculture is continuing to consolidate, which, as you said, I was here and I live on a farm. So I would go with my pickup truck on weekends or at the end of the workday to the farm sales. and I would buy stuff from small family farms that were basically auctioning off everything, going out of business. I have 7 buildings on my property, some of them empty, and I started filling them up with stuff that I bought at farm sales, which almost cost me my marriage. I couldn't resist buying a lot of really cool boxes, as the auctioneer would say. There's a box of things, you know.
Right.
How am I? This deal. How about this deal?
They usually start with that. They want to get rid of that
give me
stuff.
$4,
Yeah.
and give me $4 and $5, and I would go, wow, this looks like there's a lot of good stuff in there. And that was terrible because I saw the farms in Story County around me disappear. The land was cultivated by someone else on contract. If they owned it, they weren't farming it anymore. They sold off their equipment. They might have kept the acreage and the farmhouse and a couple outbuildings, but the farms were going out of business, and the farms are getting bigger, and they're getting bigger again.
That's key. I mean, you've hit on several things here and that's a big element. People don't think about that. The fields are bigger. The farms are bigger.
Yes.
It's not a small farming operation. You've got to have that efficiency, that economy of scale. You got to be a corporation almost to farm these fields.
Yeah, it's better to be a corporation because you have a lot of tax benefits if you're a corporation.
Right.
I've seen this spring equipment going past my farm that I've never seen before. Massive rollers.
Black out the sun.
Rollers that are obviously folded up so they can fit on a county road.
Yeah.
And I saw that piece of equipment being pulled by a huge John Deere tractor when it was actually rolling in a field, and they were rolling it like a golf course.
Yeah.
It was huge rollers. They were compacting the field. That piece of equipment must have cost a fortune.
Yeah.
And so large farmers are doing all kinds of innovative things that small farms can. But you know what? I mean, if you're growing crops and losing on every bushel that you finally produce, it's not really a great business model.
No.
Even for corporations,
Right.
It isn't.
Used to be you had to be good at farming the field, but you've got to be good at farming the government. That's the other part of it that favors corporations. There are supports out there. There are loans available. There are ways to keep in business. Their ability to ride out the storm, and they've got one right now. The little guy just can't do. Doesn't have the wherewithal.
Even large, and I respect corporate farmers and corporate agriculture because it's so sophisticated. They all have master's degrees from Iowa State.
Yeah.
They have real-time internet connections to the markets, U.S. and global markets. They have equipment that is almost autonomous now.
It's going to be robotic.
Where they can program it in. They can have on their computers, on their equipment, they know which part of the field they have to add more herbicide or more fertilizer because they've got data from the last year that shows up on their computer screens and tells them on this particular section of my farm, I need to put more fertilizer because it's draining out more. And so it's incredibly sophisticated. And I would add also something that the media rarely understands, and that is because our agriculture is so sophisticated, the price of food in the United States is incredibly low.
Yes.
Compared to most countries. You and I and everybody listening to this.
Well, look at us.
We're paying we're paying very little for the things that we are consuming because it is subsidized. The U.S. government provides great research, great data, financing, insurance. And right now, even though right now there is a real serious, let's call it the beginning of a crisis, the federal government is going to finance farmers who have been impacted by the declining imports by China because of tariffs. $15 billion, I hear, for the next round. It's already been, I think it was 12 or 13 billion for the first round of essentially compensating farmers for the impact of the trade tensions. But farmers don't like that because First of all, you can't keep that up forever. And when you lose a market like China, and I was on a Wharton School of Business, University of Pennsylvania broadcast, which I love to be on because they always have really incredible guests. And we were talking about the fact that once you lose a commodity market, once you lose the people who are buying your crop and they go somewhere else to buy it, it's hard to get them back again. Mm-hmm. I mean, if China starts now buying from Brazil and from Argentina and Australia, and they are, when are they going to shift back, and why would they shift back to buying from the U.S. when essentially they've got another source?
Yeah, and farmers don't want to be the ping pong ball in all of this, obviously.
They don't.
They want stability. They want markets.
Right.
That's where the success is at.
Right.
Some of these farmers now, if the prices drop like they have, I mean, they've got soybeans in storage in a bin.
Yeah.
And no exaggeration, what's inside that bin is worth $50,000 less than what it was just a few weeks ago because of this. It's going to continue to go down.
It is.
Now, Trump will tell you that, and he's kind of saying or intimating that this is kind of saber rattling, that this is all going to work itself out, and it's just part of the process, and that everything will return to normal here very shortly. But just the point that you raised, the fact that they're buying from other markets, they get used to that, and they develop relationships long term. Maybe it doesn't come back.
It's even more onerous. Can I use that word?
Yeah.
Is that or not one of the forbidden words?
No.
Okay. It's more onerous than that because I'm pretty sure, and I'm writing an article now that will appear somewhere. The Trump administration is not interested in just restoring the trade relationship that was there before. They're going after the balance of trade deficit that we have with all the countries that we deal with. They want to bring back production to the U.S. This is not going to end in a few months. There isn't going to be suddenly a new trade deal with China and everything will be fine because the Trump administration wants to reduce the enormous deficit that we have in the trade with China. I mean, we buy a lot more from them than they buy from us.
Oh, yeah.
And he wants to do that, and that is a long-term process. It'll be the end of the second Trump administration and beyond that. So it's going to be 10 years before I think things stabilize. The U.S. has been taken advantage of. American trade with China has been ridiculously in favor of China. The Chinese have forced American companies who want to do business there to give up their trade secrets so that Chinese companies can make the same electronics
and sell it back
other
to
products.
us and put them out of business.
Yeah, give me a break.
Yeah.
I mean, what kind of a deal is that? The American corporations and tech companies have been their own worst enemies, selfish, short-sighted, and have put the United States economy at risk by looking at that 1.5 billion Chinese that are going to buy their products and saying, well, we want that market, so we'll do whatever the Chinese government tells us to do. Yeah. Believe me, the chickens are going to come home to roost on that.
Well,
these companies are going to greatly regret that they did that. And I think you can blame Trump for the tension that exists right now. But the fact of the matter is that starting with really Jimmy Carter, but more, Clinton, Bush, Obama, were negligent and did not hold the Chinese feet to the fire at all. We were gentle on the Chinese. The companies were putting pressure on our politicians not to mess with the Chinese government because they wanted into that market. And unfortunately, it's going to be a tough slog and a painful one. And I am not an optimist at all that this is going to end soon. This is a protracted Cold War over trade, but also over power. It's power as well. All that is bundled together. And so Boy, am I bringing happy news to all of this.
And the the elephant in the room above and beyond. I tell people that if you're a farmer, you're seeing the effect right now in the prices of grain in your markets. If you're a consumer, the way that you're going to see this probably in this part of the world is Walmart. I mean, that's a huge amount of Chinese goods that are in there that are coming from overseas.
Everything is Chinese.
And so
just about
those prices are going to go up, folks. And the other thing of it is, as far as what's to come, the elephant in the room that frightens me, and I'm not going to get into that today, and I don't fully understand it, but the financial markets and Chinese ownership of bonds and financial instruments in the United States and government and the treasuries.
The Chinese have been actually financing the American budget deficit and the national debt by buying U.S. Government bonds.
Yeah.
But that I'm not worried about. Well, what are they going to do? The U.S., still guarantees things like that more than any other country. There's no other place you want to put that money, so they're going to hang on to that. And as we talked about, I've talked about this with several media groups. It's not going to make that much difference when you go into Walmart. You're going to buy a shirt. The shirt now is $4.
It's ridiculous.
It's going to be $4.50.
Okay.
$5.
Okay, that's good.
And you're going to not buy 10 shirts because the price is a little higher, so you might only buy 3. Yeah. It's not going to be catastrophic. It's going to be marginal. Most people won't even notice it. And all of the hysteria about, oh my God, the prices are going to go up at Walmart. Not by much.
Yeah.
Not by much.
Oh, that's good.
So relax on that one. And the other issue is, at least this way we will bring back all the manufacturing. No, we're not going to bring that back. Because in the U.S., manufacturing has moved beyond creating jobs for people to make shirts or to deliver products. We've moved on into robotics. And the announcement by Amazon that they're going to replace enormous numbers of people in their warehouses and have now created robots that will be the fulfillers,
I've seen that video of that. Oh, yeah. That's amazing.
It is gigantic, entire shelves of material moving through their stores without a human being anywhere around. That is, I think, the challenge we face. It's not so much, cheap labor in China. It's that because of cheap labor in China and, more expensive costs of hiring people in this country, having people working for you is kind of a pain in the neck. Because people get sick and they complain and they sue you and they don't show up for work and all of those things.
Robots don't have any problem with that.
Robots are probably not going to go into a store where they were fired and come in with an AR-15 and shoot everybody.
Good point.
And so companies are, now capable of shifting so much of it, essentially to automation. That the tariffs, if they were intended, as President Trump has said, to bring jobs back to the U.S., auto manufacturing and so on.
Well, steel.
It's not going to happen.
It didn't happen with steel.
No, I know. Yeah. So economically, our challenge is to find what people will be doing in 10 or 15 years from now for a living. And there are certain industries, healthcare is one of them, and financial services and others. What will people be doing that there aren't going to be a whole lot of jobs anymore for that, for whatever they're doing right now? And that includes, relatively low income jobs for people, because I'm sure at some point Walmart is going to start stocking their shelves with robots as well.
Well, close us out here. It's time for us to wrap up this particular podcast. But till we meet again, till we talk again, out of everything that we've talked about, and maybe something that we haven't, what should people be paying closest attention to? What keeps you up at night, if anything? What are you most concerned about right now?
I'm most concerned about the fact that we don't seem to have a kind of real visionary alternative to the direction that we're going. Because yes, unemployment is low, but wages are still pretty low for most Americans. Underemployment is pretty high. We have a lot of people who are dependent, and we haven't figured out a way to provide them with a decent way of life, with health care. Homeless people, that's a growing problem in a lot of places. And we just haven't found new innovative ideas. And what worries me the most is that the Democrats, all 23 or whatever numbers there are today running, haven't essentially come up with anything that is new and visionary. It's sort of really old and welfare state based, that we're going to give, everybody a free college education and everybody's going to have access to health care. And those things are wonderful, idealistic objectives, but how that is going to be accomplished isn't clear at this point. And I think that means there isn't a realistic alternative to the Republicans and President Trump. And the Republicans and conservatives have done very well. They have the White House, they have the Senate, they have a majority of governorships, a large majority of both the House and Senate of state legislatures. And so when you look across the country, the Democrats need, something innovative. And I'm not sure that the Green New Deal and some of those things that have been floated by the left of the Democratic Party are doable. I'm not sure they're doable. I'm looking at Europe. I'm looking at Germany and other countries that have had terrific sort of economic systems, and they're in trouble as well with old approaches. So what is the new and really exciting future that will create a lot of great jobs, make people healthy and happy? And I don't know what it is, and I hope somebody will articulate it and discover what that would look like.
Well, that's great. That's a great way to close it. We'll be back. It's session out, school's out at Iowa State University, but the doc's still here and he's still on the podcast, and we'll be up again in a matter of a couple of weeks maybe, and see what's changed, and hopefully things have improved, and maybe we've got to have another dozen Democratic candidates.
We'll have maybe 30 or 35.
We need a few. Honestly, God, some guy announced today that I'd never heard of again. And I want to ask him when I go to these events that they have, it's almost unfair, but why are you getting in at this juncture? Well, in the bigger picture of the thing, they're just another candidate. They just got in later. Not any more troublesome than the second person that got in, but still somebody's got to put a stop. And that has to do maybe with the system that you talked about with the caucuses and everything. God, can they put a limit on these?
Yeah, it is. And the fact that it's now entrepreneurial, anyone can run, and there's no party leadership to say, I don't think so, we're not going to support you. People raise their own money and run, and they love it, and they can travel, and if they don't do well...
And they sell a book.
Then they can sell a book. Exactly.
Yeah. All right, that's great. Well, again, that's Lucan Professor of Politics at Iowa State University and our go-to source on the world, really, Dr. Stephan Schmidt. And this has been another podcast by George.